Hello and welcome to The Signal, Workplace NL's Health and Safety Podcast. Workplace NL is the Workers' Compensation Board in Newfoundland and Labrador, Canada. The focus is to promote safe and healthy workplaces, provide return-to-work programs, and offer compensation to injured workers and their dependents. This series of podcasts will provide you with the latest information on how workplaces can protect the health and safety of workers. Please enjoy the show.
In the past 5 years, 140 workers in Newfoundland and Labrador have lost their lives due to workplace incidents and occupational illnesses. Occupational health and safety legislation is there to protect workers. Please be advised that this episode contains phrasing and terminology that may be difficult for some listeners to hear. I'm your guest host for this episode, Sherry Philpott, Health and Safety Advisor with Workplace NL. And today we're going to talk about serious injuries and fatalities in the workplace with John Morgan, Occupational Health and Safety Consultant from the OHS Division with Digital Government and Service NL. We will discuss emerging topic of serious injury and fatalities in the workplace and areas that we can focus on for our prevention efforts. Welcome to The Signal, John.
Thank you for having me.
John, before we get into the discussion of serious injury, would you like to give a little background on yourself and the OHS Division?
I'm an officer with the Occupational Health and Safety Division. As was mentioned, we're a division of Digital Government and Service NL, and it's our role to enforce occupational health and safety legislation and carry out the various functions and responsibilities that are set out for us under that legislation.
Serious injuries and fatalities are devastating to employees and workplaces and can have long-lasting effects. It is extremely important that the employer, supervisor, and worker understand their respective roles and responsibilities to prevent serious injuries and fatalities, and to know what to do when such tragedies happen. John, could you elaborate on what we are talking about when we refer to a serious injury?
Well, it's important to consider two particular sections of legislation. There's Section 54 of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and there's a section of the regulations which I'll touch on shortly. So under Section 54, subsection 3 of the OHS Act, it defines a serious injury as a fracture of the major bones of the body, amputation of a major part of a hand or foot, injury resulting in loss of sight of an eye, serious internal bleeding, a burn requiring medical attention, an injury caused by explosives, or poisoning by inhalation of gas that results in a partial or total loss of control. Additionally, it sets out that it's any other injury that results in an endangerment of life or that could or actually causes permanent injury. We need to balance that or compare it to Section 10 of the OHS General Regulations. And Section 10 sets out that a serious injury is an injury that places a life in jeopardy, produces unconsciousness, results in a substantial loss of blood, involves a fracture of a leg, arm, but not including a finger or a toe, involves the amputation of a leg, arm, hand, foot, finger, or toe, consists of burns to a major portion of the body, or once again causes the loss of sight in an eye. So there's considerable consistency there, but it's important to consider both. But it's especially important that legislation sets out that it also includes an incident that had or continues to have the reasonable potential to result in serious injury, disability, or death. So a serious accident that's reportable to the OHS Division includes incidents that did not result in a worker getting injured, but had significant potential.
Thanks, John. I would like to add that here at Workplace NL, a claim is considered a serious injury if it meets the definition as outlined in the OHS legislation, and the claimant either receives 4 weeks of wage loss or that their combined healthcare costs are greater than $2,000. The NL-OHS legislation requires employers to report serious injuries and fatalities. John, can you talk a little bit about the reporting requirements and how employers can go about reporting?
Well, we have to once again refer to the legislation. That's the rule book. So if we look at Section 54 of the OHS Act, it sets out that the employer or the principal contractor, whoever's directly responsible, has to immediately notify the Assistant Deputy Minister of a serious workplace accident, which is something that resulted in a serious injury or, as I just explained, had or continues to have the reasonable potential to result in serious injury, disability, or death. And the way the Assistant Deputy Minister is to be immediately notified is by calling our 24-hour accident reporting line, which is, if you're calling on the Northeast Avalon, 729-4444, or if you're outside the Northeast Avalon, dialing 1-800-729-4444. We also have to balance that with the information set out in the OHS regulations, which states under Section 10 again, that under Section 10, subsection 2, that within 3 days of the serious incident occurring that meets the criteria of being reportable, the employer has to provide us in writing with the name of the accident, the date and place of the accident, the name and address of any workers who were injured or could have been seriously injured, as well as the name and address of the physician who treated or is treating the worker for their injury.
So after an employer or a workplace experiences a serious injury, what are the next steps after an employer reports that to the OHS Division? And what is the role that the OHS Division takes?
Well, what we expect to happen is when we receive the report, we will assess the situation, determine if officers will be assigned to report, or if we will require the employer to provide us with a copy of their internal accident or incident report. As set out by legislation, the accident scene is not to be disturbed unless it's necessary to prevent further damage or to provide emergency care for the ill or injured, or to take immediate action to prevent others from becoming injured. Otherwise, the scene is not to be disturbed. Once you contact us, we will provide guidance to the employer as to what our expectations are. It's normal at that point in time to have a brief discussion as to what can or can't be done. We will provide preliminary information as to if an officer or officers will be assigned and when it's anticipated that they will arrive on scene.
Along with investigating serious injuries, there are a number of reasons why an OHS officer may attend a workplace. What should employers expect during a visit?
Well, the first thing is the OHS officer will identify themselves. Normally, they will present their ID. Most commonly, they will be in a uniform. We have a distinctive crest, so we'll identify ourselves, ask to speak with a senior representative of the employer's operations, identify our purpose for being on site, what we plan or hope to look at, identify any documents that we would like to be presented with. We will also most commonly ask that a member of the OHS committee or the entire committee or the worker health and safety representative be informed that we are on site and the purpose for our visit. And they have to be provided with the opportunity to speak to us in private, should they so choose. They also have normally, except for very special and circumstances, they'll normally be provided the opportunity to join with us during our inspection activity on site.
Okay, that's some really great information that might help relieve some stress from employers who might have an OHS officer show up at their work site. We're going to switch gears a little bit and start to discuss some ways that employers can prevent serious injuries and fatalities in their workplace. When we discuss serious injuries and fatalities, we often use the word precursor, and another word for precursor could be a risk factor. A serious injury and fatality precursor is a high-risk situation in which management controls are either absent, ineffective, or not complied with, and which will result in a serious injury or fatal injury if allowed to continue. Serious injury and fatality precursors can be found in every workplace and can be identified through the risk assessment process. John, can you describe the requirements for a risk assessment or risk profiling and how it can be used to prevent serious injuries?
Well, I should start off by once again referencing the legislation and what the legislation expects. Under Section 5 of the OHS Act, the employer is responsible, as far as is reasonably practicable, to provide and maintain a workplace and the necessary equipment, systems, tools that are safe and without risk. So it's almost impossible to have zero risk all the time when it comes to all aspects of work. However, it is certainly appropriate and expected in the context of the legislation to ensure that the workplace, work processes, tools, equipment, etc., are without an unreasonable or unacceptable level of risk. So the way the employer can accomplish that is to perform risk assessments. Also, under the OHS regulations, risk assessments are specifically required for working alone, violence, emergency plans, for those workplaces with 10 or more workers when an OHS program is required, when workers work at height, when there's to be confined space entry, when an employer is required to have a chemical or biological hazard control program, when workers may be exposed to reproductive toxins or sensitizers, or to silica, or to the risk of musculoskeletal injuries. So when those hazards are present and under those specific circumstances, the employer must perform comprehensive and appropriate risk assessments. And essentially the way I explain it, it's a risk assessment it's as simple as identifying the risks, figuring out what's worst and how likely is it to occur, and then focusing the safety measures that are to be taken based on what's worst first. So what has the greatest risk to result in serious injury, disability, or death, or severe property damage? And then how likely is that to occur? You can either add it together or multiply it, whatever it is. However you do it, it's an organized way of identifying the hazards, ranking them on objective criteria, and then based on the results of that, figuring out what you need to do to ensure an appropriate and legislatively permissible level of safety is maintained.
Okay, thank you for that. That was a great explanation of a risk assessment. What are some of the commonalities between serious injuries that you are currently seeing in the province?
Very generally speaking, there's a failure to comply with with OHS legislation or other code standards or practices. Quite often, there's a failure to comply with the employer's own work or workplace-specific safety guidelines, policies, or procedures. Quite common for persons to lack required or necessary training. All too frequently, people might fail to follow their training or what they've been told or instructed to do. And another common cause is failure to properly set up, use, and maintain personal protective equipment, tools, equipment, devices, or work structures. Very, very generally, most serious accidents are caused by people not doing what they're supposed to do, not wearing what they're supposed to wear, and not using or maintaining equipment, tools, or devices, or work structures properly.
Complacency can also be a contributing factor to a serious injury. Do you have any tips for re-engagement?
The best one would be to try to instill a good workplace culture, because we commonly say that culture eats policy and procedure. So if in your workplace people truly, and that goes from frontline worker to supervisor to manager to owner, if people truly don't understand the importance of workplace safety, if they don't demonstrate a sincere commitment to doing things the right way or the safe way, then you can have all the policies and procedures that you want. They're truly meaningless because you've demonstrated to everybody by your example that they're just that. They're paper. They don't mean what they should mean. And it's also important, and I can't overemphasize this enough, all too often I see workplaces that are very well intentioned, but they set the goal of safety performance as complying with legislation. It's always advisable to set your performance goals above the level of OHS compliance, because if you fail to meet that goal, you're operating a level lower than what the legislation permits. And when that occurs, bad things can happen. I explain it this way. OHS legislation, standards, or guidelines need to be viewed as the reason they're written and in place is because enough workers got ill, injured, or killed that the need for those safety rules or guidelines not only became necessary, but very obvious. Quite literally, OHS legislation is written, many sections are written in blood, because enough workers got seriously injured that the need for that legislation became obvious and necessary.
Excellent suggestions. Thank you, John. Do you have any final remarks before we clue up that you would like to share with our listeners?
The best thing I could suggest to anybody, I'll sum it up this way. The best way to advance safety in your workplace is for each individual person to do what's reasonable and appropriate and under your own control to do, and to cooperate with others doing the same. It's a team effort. The better the team works, the safer everybody is.
A very important message. Thank you so much for joining us today, John.
You're kindly welcome.
I think that the overall message to take away from today's podcast is that, like any injury, serious injuries are preventable. It's important that employers, supervisors, and workers understand their roles and work together to prevent these injuries. It's a serious responsibility.
Thank you for joining us today. Transcripts are available to use in your workplace to increase workers' knowledge in various occupational health and safety topics. Visit workplacenl.ca for more information on the services we provide to workplaces. Feel free to share the signal on social media to improve workplace health and safety everywhere. Thank you and have a safe and healthy day.